The Wild West did not run on beans and gunfights. It ran on bread and salt pork folded together in a saddlebag, eaten with one hand while the other held the reins. Nobody called it a sandwich. They just called it lunch. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Every trend on a modern menu right now was already invented, out of nothing, by a cowboy who couldn't stop to sit down. Number 25. Deviled ham sandwich. Walk into a boomtown saloon in Denver or Virginia City, order a 5-cent beer, and the bartender slid a plate down the counter without a word. Deviled ham, mashed rough with vinegar and pepper, spread thick on stale bread nobody minded because the ham did all the talking. Salty, sharp. Gone in 4 bites. This was the free lunch counter, a fixture of Colorado and Nevada mining boomtowns through the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, and it was never actually free. The beer paid for it, and the salt in the ham made sure you ordered a second one. That is not hospitality. That is the oldest marketing trick in American food, older than the country's love of coupons. Today, a version of that same deviled ham gets spread on toasted brioche, called artisan, and sold for $12 a plate. Same ham, different century, different price tag entirely. Number 24. Basque sheepherders chorizo sandwich. A hard link of chorizo, cut thick, laid inside a heel of dense bread that had to last a week without going stale. No plate, no table, just a man alone on a Nevada or Idaho hillside with 2,000 sheep and a knife. Basque immigrants came to the American West starting in the 1890s to herd sheep across land nobody else wanted, and they could go 3 or 4 months at a stretch without seeing another human being. Their chorizo was cured hard enough to survive that isolation without spoiling, heavy on paprika, heavy on salt, built to outlast loneliness itself. This was not a snack. This was a man's only companion for a season. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. The artisan-cured meats aisle at your grocery store is selling you a diluted, sliced-thin echo of something a sheep herder built to survive on, alone, for months. Number 23. Fried egg and bacon sandwich. Bacon first, rendered slow until the fat pooled gold in the pan. Then an egg cracked straight into that same grease, so the white crisped brown at the edges while the yolk stayed loose. Both slapped between 2 halves of a biscuit, the yolk breaking the second you bit down, running into the bacon fat, into the bread, into everything, in the gold and silver camps of California and Colorado through the 1870s and 1880s. This wasn't breakfast as leisure. It was breakfast as desperation. A man with a claim to work and no time to sit, inventing a way to eat protein and fat with one hand while he walked. This was not invention for its own sake. This was hunger solving a logistics problem nobody had bothered to name yet. Today it's called a breakfast sandwich, sold drive-through in under 60 seconds for $14, and not one person in that line knows they're eating a prospector's shortcut. Number 22. Round steak and onion sandwich. The cast iron skillet went straight into the coals. Tallow melted until it shimmered, and a thin round steak hit that heat with a sound like rain starting all at once. Onions went in after, soaking up every drop of drippings left behind, turning soft and dark gold at the edges. The whole thing landed between 2 halves of a biscuit, still hot enough to steam. On cattle drives through the open range of the 1880s, this was the chuckwagon cook's reward meal, served when a fresh steer had just been butchered and the meat hadn't yet been cut down for jerking or salting. It didn't last. It didn't need to. For one night, under an open sky with no roof for 100 miles, a hand got a hot skillet steak instead of salt pork, and that was worth more to him than any wage. That was it. Nothing more needed saying. Number 21. Jerky and hardtack pounded sandwich. 2 men, a rock and patience. That's what it took. Dried beef jerky and a brick of hardtack, both pounded flat between stones until they broke down into something closer to meal than meat. then packed wet with a spoon of bacon grease and pressed into a rough cake you could eat with your hands. On the Chisholm Trail between 1866 and 1885, this was insurance food. What a man carried when the chuckwagon fell behind or a storm scattered the herd. It didn't need a fire. It didn't need a plate. It needed nothing but a hungry man and 40 minutes of pounding. Today the same idea. Dried meat pressed and packed for the trail. Gets vacuum sealed, branded, and sold as a protein bar for $6 at a gas station. Grandma just called it not starving. Number 20. Salt pork and cracker sandwich, salt pork fried until it swam in its own grease. That grease poured hot over crumbled hardtack crackers until they went soft and dark, then packed between 2 more crackers to keep the mess contained on the walk back to the tracks. It wasn't elegant. It was calories, and calories were the only currency that mattered. Along the Transcontinental Railroad line between 1863 and 1869, this was the daily ration for the men laying track. Chinese laborers on the Central Pacific through the Sierra Nevada, Irish laborers on the Union Pacific across the plains, both crews fed on a budget that treated a man's body like a machine to be topped off, not a person to be nourished. 12 hours of swinging a sledgehammer or hauling rail burns close to 6,000 calories a day, and Skilly-Gaily was cheap enough to hit that number without bankrupting the railroad company. That is not a meal plan. That is a company doing math on human bodies and writing lunch on the invoice. The men who built this country's spine ate grease-soaked crackers to do it, and almost nobody remembers their names. Number 19. Pickled pig's feet. Sandwich the feet went into a crock of vinegar, salt, and whole peppercorns and sat for weeks until the meat came loose from the bone with a fork's worth of pressure. Pulled apart, piled onto bread, drizzled with a spoon of the pickling brine, sharp, tangy, gelatinous in a way that modern eaters flinch at and Depression-era grandmothers never once questioned. In cattle towns like Dodge City and Abilene, Kansas, through the 1870s and 1880s, pig's feet cost close to 3 cents a pound because almost nobody else wanted them. That's precisely why they mattered. This was the whole animal, used all the way down to the joints, at a time when a butcher who threw away the feet was throwing away a family's dinner. Nose-to-tail eating didn't need a name in 1875. It needed a family that couldn't afford to waste the animal at all. That is not progress. That is a phrase we invented 50 years later to sell people back the thing their own great-grandmothers already knew for free. Number 18. Sardine and soda cracker sandwich, a tin popped open with a knife, the oil poured off or kept depending on the man, the little silver fish laid whole across a soda cracker and topped with another. Breeny, metallic at the edges. Filling in a way that surprised anyone who hadn't tried it. By the 1880s and 1890s, canned sardines had become a fixture of mining and railroad camps across the West, sold for around a dime a tin. Cheap, shelf-stable, and requiring no fire, no knife beyond opening the can, no cooking skill whatsoever. This was one of the first true convenience foods in American history, decades before anyone used that phrase in an advertisement. A miner in Leadville could carry a week of protein in his coat pocket. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Canned sardines were never a poor man's compromise. They were a logistic solution so good the modern camping and survivalist industries are still selling the exact same tin at 10 times the price as an innovation. Number 17. Buffalo tongue sandwich on Sordo buffalo tongue, slow-boiled until it gave way like butter, sliced thin and dark, laid across sourdough still holding its tang, rich, almost fatty. Nothing like the lean cuts sold today in the buffalo camps of Kansas and Dakota Territory through the 1870s. Tongue was considered the prize of the animal, saved for the men who did the killing and the skinning. And that is where the anger belongs. Commercial hide hunters supplying eastern leather markets shot buffalo by the tens of thousands and left the meat to rot on the plains, taking only the hide. The camp cooks who saved the tongue, the liver, every usable piece. They were practicing something close to reverence in the middle of an industry built on waste. Nothing wasted. That was the rule at the cook fire, even while the plains around them were being stripped bare by men who never learned it. Number 16, Saubali and soda biscuit. Sandwich slice the Saubali thin. Fry it hard in its own fat until the edges curl and go the color of saddle leather, and press it between two soda biscuits still warm from the chuckwagon Dutch oven. The smell hit you before the plate did. Smoke, salt, hot lard, and underneath it, something almost sweet from the browned crust of the biscuit. Along the Chisholm and Great Western trails, through Texas and Kansas in the 1870s and 1880s, salt pork cost roughly 6 to 8 cents a pound, and a cowboy might eat it twice a day, every day for 3 months straight. This was not garnish. This was fuel for a 16-hour ride. The Hollywood version gives you beans around a campfire. The real trail diet gave you salt pork, biscuit, and grease, because fat calories kept a man upright in the saddle when nothing else would. Grandma just called it breakfast. She was right. Number 15. Chili Queens. Chili sandwich every evening in Military Plaza. The Chili Queens set up their tables and lit their lanterns, and the smell of cumin, dried chile, and simmered beef rolled out over San Antonio like a fog. A ladle of chili over torn bread, sold for a nickel a bowl, eaten standing up under lantern light while a guitar played somewhere close by. From the 1880s through the early 1900s, these women, mostly Tejanas, working outdoors, unlicensed, unregulated, entirely self-made, built one of the first street food economies in the American West, and they built it without a storefront, a permit, or a man's name on the sign. The city eventually pushed them out in the name of sanitation, a word that meant something closer to control. That is not progress. That is the erasure of the women who invented an entire cuisine before anyone thought to write their names down. Today we call a version of their work Frito pie, or a chili dog, and charge $9 for it at a stadium. Number 14. Miner's pasty sandwich stuff folded thick around beef, potato, onion, and rutabaga, crimped along one edge into a rope of a seal a man could hold in a filthy glove without the filling ever touching his hand. No plate, no fork. Just a handheld meal designed on purpose for a man who could not stop working long enough to sit down. Cornish immigrants brought the pasty to the copper mines of Butte, Montana, and the silver mines of Leadville, Colorado in the 1870s and 1880s, where it sold for around a nickel and became the standard lunch 1,000 feet underground. Some miners even ate the crimped edge last, or not at all, a handle to keep coal dust and grime off the food itself, then tossed aside or offered to the mine's spirits for luck. This was not a snack. This was engineering, the first true handheld meal built specifically for men who could not stop working long enough to sit down. They knew things about eating on the job that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. After the Civil War, companies like Borden and Underwood began mass-producing canned condensed milk, canned meat, and shelf-stable spreads at a scale no trail cook or camp kitchen could compete with, and they didn't stop at feeding soldiers. They pushed west with the railroads into the same mining camps and cattle towns that had spent decades perfecting recipes built entirely around necessity, geography, and what the land actually gave up. By the 1890s, a can of Underwood deviled ham cost less than curing your own, and it didn't require a smokehouse, a hog, or 3 generations of technique passed down at a kitchen table. That is not convenience. That is a corporation buying the silence of an entire food culture, one can at a time, until the grandmothers who knew how to do it themselves simply weren't needed anymore. The recipes didn't disappear because they stopped working. They disappeared because someone found a way to sell you a worse version faster and called it progress. Number 12. Sourdough biscuit with molasses and lard. The biscuit came apart in two ragged halves. Steam rising off the crumb, and a mother's spoon spread lard across both sides before molasses went on last, dark and slow, soaking into every crack in the bread. Sweet, heavy, the only fat and sugar some children saw in a week on homestead claims across the Great Plains through the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. This was what a mother made when the pantry held flour, lard, and a jar of molasses and nothing else, and she made it stretch across 5 children without a single one of them going to bed still hungry. This was not poor food. This was a woman doing arithmetic with almost nothing and getting the answer right every single time. Grandma just called it dessert. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 11. Antelope and sage wrap on flatbread antelope meat, lean and faintly sweet, seared hard over open coals, with crushed wild sage rubbed straight into the flesh before it ever touched heat. Wrapped tight in flatbread cooked on a flat rock at the edge of the fire, the sage perfume clinging to the meat long after the flame went out. Across the open range of Wyoming and Montana through the 1870s and 1880s, antelope was one of the few reliable proteins a solitary rider could bring down alone, and wild sage grew thick enough along the foothills that it cost nothing but the time to gather it. This was not seasoning as luxury. This was a man using the exact plants growing at his feet to make an animal he'd just killed worth eating for 3 more days. That is a kind of knowledge that required no book, no recipe, no chef's training, only attention. We have lost almost all of it. Number 10. Cowboy beans and biscuit pocket, last night's pinto beans, thick with fatback and gone cold and dense by morning, spooned into a split biscuit and pressed shut like a pocket a man could carry in his coat while he saddled up before sunrise. No bowl needed, no spoon needed once you were mounted. On chuckwagon-fed cattle drives through the 1870s and 1880s, nothing from the previous night's supper was ever thrown out, because a trail cook feeding a dozen hands off one wagon simply couldn't afford to. Cold beans became breakfast. Breakfast became a handheld meal the second someone folded a biscuit around it. This was not a recipe. This was a rule. Cook once, eat twice, waste nothing. And it fed cattle drives across 1,000 miles of open country for 2 full decades. Number 9. Trail bacon and cold cornbread stack bacon fried hard the night before. Cornbread baked the same evening in the Dutch oven, both wrapped together in cloth and left to sit until morning. When the bacon fat had soaked halfway into the cornbread and turned the whole thing dense, salty, and strangely improved by the weight. This was standard fare on cattle drives generally throughout the 1870s and 1880s, built for one purpose only: survival inside a saddlebag through 6 or 8 hours of riding, sun and dust, with no refrigeration and no second chance if it spoiled. A trail cook didn't ask whether bacon and cornbread tasted better cold. He asked whether it would still be safe to eat by noon. Everything else was a luxury nobody on that trail could afford to consider. Number 10. Liverwurst sandwich out of German-American delis across the Midwest in the 1930s and 40s, where organ meat wasn't a hard sell. It was Tuesday. Liverwurst, spread thick and soft, almost like pâté before pâté had a fancy name in this country. Dark rye bread underneath. Raw onion, sliced paper-thin, layered on top. A smear of yellow mustard cutting through the richness. The smell of it, earthy, dense, faintly sweet from the rye, filled a kitchen the second the wax paper came off. Real science, sitting right there on that plate. Organ meat delivered iron and B vitamins that city diets in that era badly lacked. This was not offal. This was a family getting nutrients most of their neighbors were quietly going without, and calling it lunch. Number 9. Head cheese sandwich, say it out loud to somebody under 40 and watch their face. Their great-grandmother didn't flinch. Head cheese. Meat from the head of the hog, set in its own natural gelatin, sliced thin like a terrine. Rye bread. Mustard, vinegar, sometimes a scattering of pickled onion on top for bite. In the Eastern European immigrant butcher shops of the industrial Midwest through the 1920s and 30s, head cheese was proof, not shame. Proof that a butcher, and a family, respected an animal enough to use every part of it. This was not waste avoidance. This was reverence, dressed up as a sandwich. Number 8. Pimento cheese sandwich, the South's other signature spread, and the one that actually made the jump to fame, just not for the people who invented it. Sharp cheddar, grated fine. A jar of pimentos, chopped and folded through until the whole spread turned a soft coral pink. Mayonnaise, binding it together into something thick enough to hold its shape on a knife. Spread onto soft white bread, the edges trimmed off for company, left ragged for family. Southern households built this constantly through the 1920s and 30s. Cheap cheese stretched with pimentos to feed more mouths off less. This was not a spread. This was a family multiplying what little cheese they could afford. Here's the corporate betrayal, plain and documented. In 2016, Duke's Mayonnaise, a brand that had spent nearly a century as the quiet, unglamorous mayonnaise of poor Southern kitchens, partnered with celebrity chefs and food media outlets to relaunch pimento cheese as an authentic Southern heritage product, selling pre-made tubs in specialty grocery stores at 4 and 5 times the cost of making it at home. The recipe was identical to what sharecropper families and mill-town households had been stretching cheddar with for 100 years. The company didn't invent anything. They just waited until enough time had passed that nobody remembered where it came from, and then sold it back to us as discovery. That is not innovation. That is memory theft with a price tag on it. Number 7. Deviled ham sandwich, a little can, a little devil printed right there on the label, and a whole family's lunch inside it. Canned deviled ham. Ground ham, fat, spices, blended smooth, spread onto white bread with a smear of mustard. In urban working-class kitchens of the 1930s, a single can, costing a handful of cents, fed a family of 4 2 full lunches. That was not stretching thin. That was a mother doing math faster than any calculator every single week and getting it right. Number 6. Salmon patty sandwich, rural South, rural Midwest, 1930s. A can of salmon and a crack of an egg turned into something that tasted, for one meal, like the ocean had reached all the way inland. Canned salmon, mashed with cracker crumbs and a beaten egg, formed into patties, fried until the outside went dark and crisp, laid onto bread with whatever was on hand. Mustard, a little mayonnaise, sometimes nothing at all. Here's the part nobody talks about. Canned salmon carries the fish's bones, softened by the canning process, and those bones deliver a real dose of calcium most rural diets in that decade badly needed. That is not a coincidence. That is a hidden nutritional gift, sitting quietly in a 10-cent can, doing more for a family's health than they ever knew. Number 5. Cottage cheese and jelly sandwich. It sounds like a mismatch. It was a strategy. Cottage cheese spread thick across white bread. A spoonful of jelly on top, sweet cutting straight through the tang. Families across the country leaned on this combination through the 1930s as a protein stretcher dressed up to taste like a treat. A way to get a working kid to eat something good for them without a single argument at the table. Number 4. Apple butter sandwich, number 4. The apple butter sandwich out of Pennsylvania Dutch farmland, and this one started months before it ever hit a plate. Every autumn, families spent whole days over copper kettles, stirring apples down slow until they turned dark, thick, and deeply sweet. Enough apple butter to fill jars that would last the entire winter. Spread onto buttered bread, it turned plain white bread into something that tasted like the whole harvest concentrated into 2 bites. One autumn of preserving fed a full winter of lunches. That is not a recipe. That is a family planning ahead for a season they knew was coming and refusing to be caught without. Number 3. Molasses sandwich number 3. The sorghum sandwich, sweetened not with sugar, which cost money, but with sorghum molasses, pressed and boiled down from cane grown right there in the southern fields. Bread, butter, a heavy pour of molasses, dark and slow moving, almost black at the edges of the jar. It stuck to your fingers, your teeth, the roof of your mouth, and nobody minded. In the rural South of the 1930s, sorghum was often the only sweetener a family produced entirely themselves, start to finish, without spending a single cent at a store. This was not progress. That is a family growing, harvesting, and processing their own sweetness from the ground up, at a time when most Americans had already surrendered that skill entirely. And today it shows up as artisanal sorghum toast, $8 a plate, at cafes that couldn't press a stalk of cane if their lives depended on it. Number 2. Cowboy son of a gun sandwich number 2. The son of a gun sandwich, straight out of a chuck wagon on the Texas plains, built by a trail cook who did not have the luxury of wasting a single scrap off a butchered steer, leftover roasted beef, chopped fine, folded together with pan drippings until it turned rich and dark, piled onto a split biscuit, still warm from the wagon's Dutch oven. Out on cattle drives across Texas and the Great Plains from the 1880s through the 1930s, trail cooks, men everyone just called Cookie, built entire meals out of organ meat and scraps that would otherwise be left behind on the trail. Nothing rode 2 days on a chuck wagon and came back to camp uneaten. This was not rustic charm. This was survival logistics disguised as a biscuit sandwich, feeding cowboys who'd ridden 12 hours and needed to ride 12 more the next day. Number 1. Fried mush sandwich, the cheapest calorie in America, turned into something that felt like a meal instead of a ration. Cornmeal mush, cooked down slow into a thick porridge, poured into a loaf pan and left to set overnight in the cold. Sliced the next morning, fried in a hot skillet until the outside turned dark gold and crackling while the inside stayed soft as custard. Pressed between 2 pieces of bread or tucked into a split biscuit, sometimes with syrup, sometimes with nothing but salt. In the rural Midwest and South through the 1930s, a pound of cornmeal cost 3 cents and could feed a family for 2 full days. Grandma just called it breakfast. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Closing, fry the bologna. Render the fat. Slice the tomato while it's still warm from the vine. These 25 sandwiches weren't sad. They were engineered by hands that wasted nothing off a hog, a chicken, a stalk of cane, or a can of salmon, and knew exactly what a body needed to survive a shift underground, a trail ride, a southern summer, a depression that never fully let go. The women who built these meals didn't need a nutrition label. They read their families' bodies and fed them accordingly, decade after decade, without ever once calling it a skill. And somewhere along the way, a food industry that profited from our forgetting sold the same recipes back to us with better lighting and worse prices and called it discovery. That is not discovery. That is theft with a receipt. Try one this week. Just one. Fry the bologna. Spread the schmaltz. Slice the onion thick, comment below, and tell me which one your grandmother made.